Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to open this morning session on Road to COP27, integrating human rights into local adaptation planning. First, I would like to thank all speakers and panelists. We have Victor Bernard as RWI Program Officer, and we have Professor Wiwandari Handayani from University of Diponegoro. Thank you for coming. And we have panelists that will join us online today. Ms. Romchat from OHCHR Regional Office Southeast Asia. And we have Mr. Albert Salamanca from Stockholm Environment Institute. Thank you for joining. And also Mayor Jerry Trenas from Philippines and Mayor Genius Umar from Pariaman City, Indonesia. So for today's discussion, why this is important is we all have experienced extreme weather event exacerbated by climate change. These impacts disproportionately affect marginalized and disadvantaged groups, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and ethnic minorities. Therefore, adapting to the impacts of climate change is no longer a choice, but this is an urgent priority. Doing it right will save lives, enhance resilience, and protect human rights. One of our research, as mentioned earlier, it will be central for the discussion today, and this is based on our collaboration with SEI. It's on National Adaptation Plan and how human rights has been integrated into those NAP across countries. Human rights considerations, what we found, are rarely incorporated into NAPs that countries are developing as part of their commitments under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Therefore, human rights is an important consideration in adaptation planning processes in order to understand the gaps and identify best practices in making adaptation fairer and more equitable. Similarly, at the local level, as we have seen from yesterday plenary sessions, several local governments have presented what they have been done during yesterday's session. Therefore, it is imperative that local government integrate human rights and human rights-based approach into their local adaptation plan. With the increasingly hazardous impacts of climate change in cities, it is clearly important that cities are the first responder to climate change and will be in turn play a central role in developing and implementing climate change adaptation policies and programs. Therefore, it is important to ensure that local adaptation is grounded in human rights, which is a precondition to protect and empower groups that are disproportionately affected by climate change and frequently excluded from climate change adaptation policies and programs. In today's session, we will discuss challenges, drivers, and opportunities to integrate human rights-based approach into local climate adaptation plans, taking lessons from experts and cities in Asia. I would like to close the opening by informing you that we will be participating in COP27, and our delegation will be led by Mr. Victor, and we hope we could promote the interlinkages between climate change and climate change adaptation and human rights. For more information, you can contact our colleague, Windy and Victor. Thank you very much.
Very excellent speech. Thank you, Mbak Tuti. And so now, I should have called you both earlier, but so we will have the two first presentations by my colleague, Victor Bernard. So Victor, if you can move up here. So Victor is the program officer for Raoul Wallenberg. He's been in the position for a bit now, and he leads our work on the interlinkages between human rights and in the environment, as well as business and human rights. So he has a very broad portfolio. As I mentioned earlier, he's one of the co-authors of our recently published research on national adaptation and human rights. And another speaker that we will have in this session is Professor Wiwandari. Professor, please. So Professor Wiwandari is from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Faculty of Engineering, Diponegoro University, Indonesia. Professor Wiwandari's research focuses on urban and regional resilience, mostly in the context of disasters risk management, climate adaptation, and governance. She is also one of the contributing authors of the IPCC report on cities, settlement, and key infrastructure. So you both will have each of you 20 minutes, so you will start, and then Professor Wiwandari. And then for just a little bit of housekeeping, we will do questions and answers after Professor Wiwandari's presentation. And the questions will be taken through Slido, so our good colleagues here will put it on the screen. But if you're not comfortable with technologies, Yana here will help you with a piece of paper, and then you could write it down, your questions. Is that okay? Good. Thank you so much, guys.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Perfect. I hope you all slept well. So yes, as Wendy said, I will be presenting more broadly on human rights in the context of local adaptation. In this presentation, I will attempt to do three things. One is demonstrate briefly how human rights and climate change adaptation are interlinked. Second is to make a business case for why cities, many of you who are here, are instrumental in making climate change adaptation swifter and more effective. And third, share some examples on how cities can incorporate human rights and gender equality to also ensure that adaptation outcomes are inclusive and more equitable. Next slide, please. Next one. Perfect. So moving on to the first question. What are the links between climate change adaptation and human rights? As Dr. Tuti Alawiya just mentioned, we are reminded repeatedly by scientists and thought leaders that climate change is the defining issue of our time and is quickly becoming a human rights crisis. Researchers warn that 85% of the world's population, most of whom reside in Asia and the Pacific, or developing, at least developed countries as well, has already experienced climate-induced extreme weather events. The majority of them are in Asia and the Pacific, which is home to an approximately 4.3 billion people, and they are collectively bearing the heaviest burden. Nearly half of them reside in cities, which are set to become climate change hotspots, as most of them are located in coastal areas or on floodplains. In spite of this, urban populations in Asia and the Pacific have been growing at the fastest rate in the world in the past 2 decades, which have brought prosperity on the one hand, but also increasing poverty and unplanned informal settlements and slums, leaving them more vulnerable to climate change in the near future. Some effects that many of these scientists mention is higher mortality rate and illness from vector-borne and waterborne diseases and extreme weather events, food insecurity and resource scarcity, housing shortages, rapidly growing populations due to climate-induced migration to cities, amongst many other issues. These climate risks will negatively impact a series of protected human rights, including the rights to life, shelter, food, and water. The rights of the most vulnerable groups in urban populations will be disproportionately affected. In addition, disasters and climate shocks will exacerbate pre-existing inequalities and exclusion, which in turn render these groups even more vulnerable and exposed to climate change or to future disasters and climate change related risks. Next slide, please. So why should cities care or work on adaptation to protect their residents' human rights as well as contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, I will make 3 points here. As you all know, cities are at the forefront of climate change adaptation. That has been mentioned yesterday, and that was also mentioned earlier. The first point as a result of that is that unlike mitigation, adaptation occurs at the lowest governance levels, where the impacts of climate change are being felt. Thus, actions that increases resilience as well as adapt to specific and immediate climate hazards need to take place at the local level, led by local level actors such as cities. Secondly, cities, given their closer proximity to the communities than their national governments, can generally provide quicker and more targeted support when it comes to information, resources and funds, and so forth. Thirdly, cities and other local actors, and this is, I think, one of the more important points, know their communities best and are able to mobilize information and resources based on their identification or their mapping on who is most vulnerable in their communities, the risks they are exposed to, as well as the different aspects of living conditions in their locations. Whereas an outsider may only see groups within cities or locations as homogeneous. There are, of course, a number of immediate benefits for cities to take the lead. So it's not only a responsibility for them, but it can also be beneficial for cities. And I make this point in three aspects. Investment in adaptation is cheaper than spending on disaster relief and recovery in all perpetuity. Second is adaptation helps unlock a city's economic potential by encouraging investments. Thirdly is adaptation results in near-term health, societal, and economic benefits with co-benefits of nature-based and green adaptation solutions. Next slide, please. So what role does human rights play, and what resources does RWI have, or has RWI developed to support local governments? Besides the direct impacts of climate change and disasters that we have talked extensively on, or that I've discussed extensively, measures that respond to these can also have negative impacts on human rights. Human rights-based approach and gender equality approaches therefore play a fundamental role in ensuring that the response to climate change and disasters is inclusive and equitable, and contributes to societal transformations that leave no one behind. The link between human rights, gender equality, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation is also recognized in both the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction as guiding principles. Yet when we look closely at these instruments, when we look closely at the guides that exists prior to our work on the FIRE framework, we can see that we don't get insights into human rights and gender equality and how they should be systematically incorporated into disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation programs. So our experience under the BRDR program, which is a program that we implemented together with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, and the Stockholm Environment Institute, underscores the importance of developing tools and guidelines that can help states and local governments to practically and systematically incorporate human rights and gender equality into existing operational approaches to DRR and climate change adaptations at all levels. In response, RWI and its partners developed the so-called FIRE framework, which is the framework for integrating rights and gender equality. And it consolidates already recognized human rights and gender equality standards and principles in this field. This was done without losing sight of the critical social norms and contexts that shape people's different exposures, vulnerabilities, capabilities to respond to climate change and disasters. It offers practical guidelines and tools on how states at national and subnational levels can systematically integrate both human rights and gender equality in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation contexts. So the FIRE framework, as you can see here behind me, comprises of several dimensions that consolidates the different standards. So it literally consolidates different standards into 6 fundamental dimensions. One is participation and access to information. Second is non-discrimination. Third is fundamental rights and equality. Fourth is governance systems and structures. Fifth is agency and empowerment. Sixth is social norms and context. A host of indicators derived from international standards and guidelines add depth to the framework, and you can find more information about the framework on our website. So the FIRE framework represents a systematization of a wide amount of learning and resources out there on human rights and gender equality. And this framework, rather than creating something new, it synthesizes existing standards, guidelines, and good practices into a tool that is practical and effective for different actors. Next slide, please. Here I will highlight just quickly some of the tools and training courses that we have developed using the FIRE framework. One tool is the actual consolidation of the standards and guidelines themselves. The document, as you can see here, has been used in different kinds of contexts to support actors to conduct so-called self-assessments on the extent to which human rights standards and guidelines are reflected in their countries and their local areas, law and policy, as well as in their subnational practice and procedures. And what you can see here on the screen are examples of using the FIRE framework's different dimensions, such as governance systems and structures and fundamental rights and equality, and the consolidated standards on the right there that we draw from. For instance, the Interagency Standing Committee's operational guidelines on the protection of persons in situations of natural disaster. So we have different guidelines on the right-hand side that indicates where these particular standards come from. You can also see a reference to CEDAW's general recommendation number 37 on gender dimensions of climate change and disaster risk reduction. So those are just 3 of the approximately 20 standards that we have consolidated and have used in the previously mentioned self-assessments for partners in different countries in the region. But feel free to check out our website for more information. Next slide, please. So we also have a traffic light system, and here we have 2 consolidated standards that we use as an example. Firstly, we have accessible, confidential, supportive, and effective mechanisms for all women wishing to report gender-based violence. And then the second one, we have a consolidated standard to ensure that persons with disabilities are fairly represented in camp governance mechanisms, for example. The traffic lights represents the responses to a self-assessment form from participants who took part in the ADPC's regional training on rights-based and inclusive approaches to early warning, evacuation, and camp management in 2021. Each number indicates the degree to which the participants deem these standards to be reflected in national and subnational law and practice. As for the second standard, with regards to persons with disabilities being fairly represented in camp governance mechanisms, 63% of the participants responded that this has not been adequately incorporated into their national disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation law and policy. So using the FIRE framework, just showing it here, helps bring a wide range of human rights and gender equality standards and guidelines to the fore, many of which would otherwise have been overlooked or addressed only in a cursory manner. Next slide, please. So in conjunction with the development of the FIRE framework, RWI has also partnered with the Stockholm Environment Institute, as Wendy mentioned, on drafting this research paper that you can see behind me on human rights in the processes of national adaptation planning. This examines the extent to which published national adaptation plans have incorporated human rights and gender equality in accordance with international human rights law and standards. I think Dr. Albert Salamanca, who is here with us today, will give us some greater detail, more details into the findings and recommendations of this paper. But it echoes a number of recent reports that have underscored that systematic disregard of both nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans of the needs and the rights of various marginalized groups is prevalent. So these plans, these policies have there is a common trend. And the trend is that these marginalized groups are often disregarded. There was a recently published report titled Disability Inclusion in National Climate Committee Commitments and Policies, which was published, I think, a couple of months ago, so you can also Google that. This report showcases how persons with disabilities were among the most vulnerable to climate impacts, yet many of them have been systematically ignored in adaptation plans. Only 45 countries out of the 192 parties to the Paris Agreement have referred to persons with disabilities, and even then only in a cursory manner, without including meaningful mechanisms to consult with this very group. A similar trend is found in our research, and I think Albert will talk about that in a moment's time, a trend which stems from a limited understanding of the connections between the rights and needs of various marginalized groups and the climate crisis. And there is also a limited understanding on how human rights-based and gender equality approaches can ensure that the response to climate action can be more equitable and fairer, leaving no one behind. So if you go to the last slide, please. Thank you. So based on what I've said and our 5 years of experience here in the region, 4 things are clear. Firstly, most cities, especially in the developing and least developed countries, will become increasingly vulnerable to climate change risks that will exacerbate or perpetuate pre-existing inequalities and exclusion, and adversely impact human rights for all. Second, cities are at the forefront in climate change adaptation, as any adaptation efforts have to occur at the lowest governance levels where the impacts of climate change are being most felt. Thirdly, besides the direct human rights impacts of climate change and disasters, measures that respond to these can also have a negative effect on human rights. Therefore, human rights-based approaches and gender equality approaches must be integral to local climate change adaptation policies and measures to ensure that these responses and policies are inclusive and equitable and contributes to societal transformation in line with our SDG commitments of leaving no one behind and our commitments to human rights. Finally, my final point here is RWI has conducted a series of research on human rights and climate change adaptation. I've presented 2 here. One is our FIRE framework report that you can find on our website to support a wide range of actors' knowledge bases and capacity to systematically integrate human rights and gender equality. We also have a study that examines the extent to which human rights have been incorporated into published NAPs. Now, the next step is to fine-tune these tools and test them in various climate change adaptation contexts across the Asia and the Pacific. And I hope we can spend the next couple of years doing that, and we'll probably need your support in achieving the most representative research in the near future. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks for listening. And then now we have Professor Wandari, and just another housekeeping. Yes, you are very quick, Professor Wandari. So you can also see your PPT on the screen in front of you. And yes, you have 20 minutes. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wendy, and hello, everybody. Good morning for our online participants. Good morning from GwangJu. Thank you very much for the RWI for inviting me and giving me opportunity to share some highlights and reflections from the IPCC Working Group 6 Assessment Report. This report mostly talk about cities, settlements, and key infrastructures. And one of the important message from the report is that governance and inclusiveness is very important. So when we talk about city and urban development, we cannot focus only on the physical, infrastructural things, construction, and so on, but actually governance, participations is the backbone to ensure that all the decision-making process, participation of different stakeholders can manage well, and it may lead to optimum output and outcome to minimize the climate change impact. But before we come to that discourse, please allow me to start the conversation on urbanization. When we talk about cities, when we talk about urban development, we need to realize with one important inevitable phenomenon that since almost a decade ago, actually, world urban population has outnumbered the world rural populations. But that is not only the problem. The problem is that urban development or urban growth is not happening evenly across the globe. It's only focused on particular growth centers, mostly all the cities located in the vulnerable coastal area, facing a lot of climate change pressures. And most of the cities are already developed beyond their carrying capacity. So there's a great challenge for most cities worldwide to balance, right, between the needs to maintain the economic growth, increase the social welfare, and so on, and at the same time also need deal with all the environmental pressures. And I believe, also stated in the report, that enabling environments can support adaptations in ways that are also sensitive to indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. Sustainable key infrastructures then appears as an important concept when we talk about urban development, when we talk about cities. Not only to make a kind of transformative innovation, moving from the gray infrastructural work into a kind of hybrid mode by promoting a more green and blue infrastructural works, but the idea of promoting sustainable infrastructures, as mentioned in the report, is also need to be emphasizing at least 4 elements, as you can see on the slide. We, as the city stakeholders, need to address the urban challenges. At the same time, also need to address the environmental pressures, but not only that, too big homework, but actually social setting is important. We all know one size does not fit all, right? So each city have their own uniqueness, have their own local setting, which need to be well incorporated in when we do some climate change adaptations, mostly the importance to make it work at the local level. Last but not least, we need to make it in a bankability major ways. Yeah, it's no way if we have innovation but we cannot fund it, it will not. It will never become to the implementation. So I think these 4 elements is one of the challenge, and to make it work, I would like to connect that with the governance aspect. And for that sense, it is very important to promote what we call as collaborative governance. Collaborative here, it's not only about communication, it's not only about coordination, but it is how about to cooperate and to collaborate in the sense that they are process of shared creation, they are a process of sharing ideas and resources. It's very important. It involves cooperation to build commonality, to process, there's a process of negotiation in the sense that as multi-level governance measures that support local government can foster robust adaptation approaches and address risk and vulnerability across scales. So through the collaborative governance, there are ways of each local stakeholders ranging from the government, academia, NGO, community, private sectors, international organization can contribute a role optimally based on their authority and optimize their potential. And there is an urgent call of collaborative actions at the local level. We need to move forward, not only talking about communication and coordination again, but we at the moment have to make it in a collaborative way. And for that reasons, we then need to talk about the strategic role of local stakeholders. Victor's on your first presentation already emphasized that actually cities is the front line when we talk about local adaptation. And when we talk about local stakeholders, it's not actually only about the city governments. Indeed, yeah, the city governments can invest directly and work in partnership with community, private sector, and so on. But then we need also to collaborate, the government need to collaborate with other types of stakeholders, including the private and business investment, to provide the key infrastructure, housing construction, and so on. We need to create what we call as network community actions. As it's believed, the network community can go beyond the neighborhood scale, yeah, to improve and to address widespread vulnerability. And it is also an important role on transnational networks of local government. Maybe later on I will talk more about this based on the Semarang experience, where the transnational networks were important to promote local adaptation. And the important role or the strategic role of the local government can further force what we call as co-production of adaptation strategies. Co-production at least will have three advantages. Co-production can advance urban sustainability and social justice for sure, can rise or brings together diverse sets of citizens' interests, and most importantly also, co-production can increasing public awareness. So public interest, public awareness, and I think it's very important also in parallel to work and to promoting what we call as social justice. And with that kind of co-production, strategic role of the local stakeholders, we hope that it can address such barriers to climate adaptations. As according to the IPCC report, there are at least eight types of barriers. Without further explanation on that, the barriers is ranging from the problems on financial, problems on the lack of human resources and capacities, problems in political commitment, problems in uncertainty about the future, about the institutional fragmentation, legal issues, competition of adaptation with other policy agendas, and of course, yeah, we cannot forget data and knowledge generation, also another barriers that expectedly can be well addressed if there are collaboration, if there are more involvement of the local stakeholders, and there are co-production process. I think those three is are the important message that I would like to highlight from the report to connect between the cities and the governance aspect in addressing the climate change impact. Another thing that I would like to also a bit elaborate in this opportunity is about solution space for the policy action gap. There are a framework in which to promote the local climate change adaptation, we need to do it at multi-level, at multi-actor, and with the place bound. As you can see from the slide, there are at least 6 things that we can do, or important highlights or homework to reduce the gap. We need to be able to address inequality among different situations, among different stakeholders' capacity, among regions. We need to enable the co-production process I've already mentioned earlier. We need to deliver on the needs for the most vulnerable, no one left behind. I think it's very important highlight in the current situation. We need move from the business as usual to the transformative improvement in the adaptation. We need to support visionary vision to find innovative solution, and we need to facilitate and encourage more and more coordination and involvement of different stakeholders. So since we have limited times, I just want to give this highlight here, then here and there to show some important keywords that we need to be addressed, at least in the following years. And of course, their policy instruments need to be there to enable adaptation. The policy should be supported with a robust process, visioning, with the proper baseline studies, with such a great development priorities process. It should be supported by a good profile, risk assessment, impact assessment tools, and monitoring system. And I believe what the RWI has developed through the FIRE concept, as Victor has mentioned earlier, is one of the platform that can be optimized to ensure that the planning and the management can be well managed in the process. And other than that, we also need to not to neglect what we call as adaptive social protection. So when we talk about the policy as a business as usual, we need also thinking further on the social justice perspective about the adaptive social protection. And from the IPCC report, there are at least 4 categories and examples in regard to the adaptive social protections. There are the needs of policy or instrument for the social safety nets or social assistance, the need for us to elaborate more for the social insurance platform to protect the most vulnerable people, the labor market policies, and also livelihood development measures to show that actually parallelly we need to think not only the physical or the economic aspect, but at the same time we are also challenged to also include to protect the social aspect and to protect the local people. With that, I would like to end my presentation with a case study from Semarang. I come from Semarang and I work closely with the local stakeholders in Semarang at least since almost or more than 10 years ago. Semarang is located in the Java Island with more than 1.8 million inhabitants, located in the coastal area, certainly experience what we call as sinking city, and also at the same time experience rapid urbanization. And with those challenges, the Semarang is the first city is actually engaged in the international platforms, so-called Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, and also a part of the 100 Resilient Cities, as now it is called as Global Resilient Cities Network. And by involving in this kind of network, we can see that the planning approach in the city transforming toward a more innovative planning solution, in the sense that it may involve more and more local stakeholders, private community, and through the international platform partners, they are continuously capacity improvement. And it is proved by the award given by the national government, as the city now was awarded with the best planning document and innovation in 3 years secondly, from 2018 up to 2020. In 2021, the national government decided not to include Semarang anymore. And it is shown this as a kind of, I can call it of the output as the result of the network that already been started since years ago, and make a continuous changing mindset of the local stakeholders and create more collaboration in the cities. And it is also one of the chosen cities to further elaborate in the IPCC report. And from the pathways, since they start their involvement in the international network, as the pathways from their movement from the business as usual to what we call as transformative adaptation, I learned that at least there are 3 key lessons that we can further hoping that Semarang could be becomes the leading city for the local climate change adaptation. The first is we need to realize that actually transnational institution and partnership are critical enablers. So local government, they cannot do alone. They need to develop partnership with transnational institutions. Secondly, scaling up programs and replication of adaptation actions are increasingly important to close the gap between planning and implementation. So we need to continuously work. We cannot just work in 1 to 3 years and then leave it. We need to make it continuously from time to time, and we need somebody to make it, to make as a local enabler to ensure the process. And last but not least, it's also important to have a kind of sustainable financing platform from both external and internal source to propose what we call as adaptation strategies, as it allows for more capacity building, technology transfer, and program implementation. Sustainable financing forced the government to move beyond their conventional budgeting. So it's no there will no enough sources to make all the adaptation work if it is only based on the government budget. So we need to elaborate more innovative funding, non-conventional, by creating more partnership. So I would like to end my presentation by this slide, emphasizing a little bit that creating enabling environment is important to promote local climate change adaptation, to move from communication, coordination into cooperation and collaboration. There are some reflections that are important. The first is network development. It's very important for the local government and all local stakeholders as a part of the learning process. Need to change the perception from the sectoral to collective, from the incremental to comprehensive. And in a way, we need to move toward what I call as adaptive governance that can maintain collaborative action. With that, it is expected there will be a kind of mutual agreement and commitment to build the coalition to move and deal with these climate change issues together, supported by a sustainable budget. I think that's all from me, and thank you very much again for the invitation. I give back to Windy. Thank you, Windy.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wandari, and thank you, Victor. And for those of you who wants to read a little bit more to what Professor Wandari specifically have mentioned earlier, she actually submitted a paper for this forum. So please check out your program books, where you will find her very insightful paper, I would say. And now we have about 10 minutes or so to take questions. So please show the Slido. Yes. Yes, so you can go to slido.com and access this, okay, this QR code. Or if there's any code that they could just punch in. Yes. Can you share the first slide for Slido again, please? Technology is always a challenge, isn't it? So while waiting, I think I have a question for both of you, but especially for Professor Wandari, because one of the challenges that you mentioned in your presentation is about sort of political commitment where it has to stay on. And with your experience in Semarang for many years, and for Semarang for 3 years in a row, receiving the same sort of acknowledgement, how do you see, how do you think the government maintains its commitment independent from who's in the mayor's seat? So I think that's a big question that we've been discussing a lot in our training, especially how to maintain government commitment in the face of changing political situation. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, I think, of course, yeah, we all agree that political commitment is very important, and the front line for this is the mayor for the city, right? But in most cases, as the fact that the mayor have only limited time, yeah, to lead the cities, then it is also, from my experience in Semarang, there are two things actually that maybe I can share. The first one is how to have what I call as local champions at the middle level, because maybe the mayor can change, but the government employee is still there. Right. So it's very important to have the local champion, and it's good if we can add more and more, yeah, local champions from time to time. And I believe the Semarang has some local champions to guide all the process. That's the first one. And the second one is to connect the government with the local institutions there. it could be local NGO, it could be local universities, because local NGO and local universities will always be there, regardless whoever the person, but the institution is still there. So I think it's very important to at least maintain these two things. Yeah, find the local champions at the mid level, and the second one, how to maintain the connection, strong connection between the local government with the local institutions. Yeah.
And do you have any inputs, Victor, while we're waiting for the questions?
Well, I would like to actually echo what my colleague just said. Yes, training of civil servants is key because they're the ones who remain whilst politicians are elected on a cyclical basis, so they come and go. But it is you who work on urban planning and on implementing programs that will remain. But also, it is important that we develop plans and policies to measure, to have, first of all, to set a baseline on where we are and where we want to go, and having a scientific way of calculating our achievements, essentially, towards a particular adaptation goal as well as the sustainable development goals. So having localized national adaptation plan is key. That is developed and articulated in an inclusive and a participatory manner. So it reflects all parts of that community. So those are the two aspects. And of course, access to knowledge is another one, and multi-stakeholder engagement between local and national governments, because local governments, even though they want to, they may not have access to all of the funding that they need. We have seen that in the Philippines, for example, where some of the cities have really ambitious policies, frameworks in place, but just don't have the money. And so they need access to some sort of a funding stream, and that can only happen through multi-stakeholder engagements.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have already on the screen 2 questions. You can read it, or 3 now. Good. First, how do you expect the developed countries commit to such that above mentioned good measures? And not only for the developed countries assigned for NAP and LAP. I think we can take all 3 for this Q&A session. And to Professor Wuandari specifically, how to ensure the sustainable commitment from the government, which is a bit the same as we have discussed just now. And maybe the third one is how to encourage local governments so that they want to pay attention to this issue. They already know about the problem, but maybe not no action, but maybe lack of action. So maybe if Victor and Professor Wuandari can give your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Just on the last question, how to encourage local government. Well, one way RWI encourages local government is to ensure that in our training, that we help them develop systems that are participatory, because one of the main cause of the lack of action is because there hasn't been a process where many of the, let's say, challenges that comes with climate change have been raised. So they haven't really seen those problems as urgent until the systems that enables people to raise those issues have been in place, or have been put in place. So I would say that could be one of the solutions in the toolkit to make sure that governments take action. But it's also having a participatory system also ensures that people can hold their local governments to account. So if they have open sessions, then people can ask questions on where the actions are. But I would also, reiterate what I said earlier, that there are many, there are ambitions within the local governments, but the reason why it hasn't translated into action is because of lack of funding. So as a citizen, of course, we can have our expectations on local governments, but at the end of the day, yes, they will have goals, they will have frameworks in place, but we need money to do adaptation. And I also emphasize this in the COP climate negotiations, that there is a need to ensure that there's a funding stream for cities, and that cities need to be represented in all of this, because they're the ones who are at the forefront when engaging with citizens and the climate impact. So, and that hasn't been the case in the previous COPs.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I would like to continue by addressing I think the third question first, yeah, about how to encourage the local government so that they want to pay attention to the issues. Based on my experience, it will be very difficult to make the conversation to the local governments if we purely talk only from the environmental perspective. So I would like to address what I call as the co-benefit, how in a way we can find and start the conversation by combining the environmental challenge. We talk about, let's say, tidal flood, sea level rise, and so on, with somehow from the perspective of the economic, because most of the time I believe in most, especially in most developing countries, yeah, economics always regard as the major issues, and that's one of the, I think, a good way to start the conversation to attract the attention from the government by talking this in the both way, combining the environment and the economic issues, yeah. And I would like also to add to the previous questions about how to ensure the sustainable commitment from the government, other than maintaining or having the local champion through training, like Victor has mentioned. It is also important to bind them in the development planning document. So I think it will be important for each city to have their own local adaptation planning that link to the national adaptation planning. And from this local adaptation planning, then it could be formalized in their national local development planning, or midterm and long-term planning. So regardless whoever the leader will be, it's already mentioned in the long-term development planning, and somehow the message will always be there and never been missed, yes, expectedly. And yeah, how it is more and more questions doing this. So I think maybe I would like to add one more before offer this to Victor again. How do you expect the developed countries commit to such that above mentioned good measures? Yeah, I think the existence of a lot of global network is very effective, I think, to become a platform for shared learning. I got this from my experience involved not only in Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, but also from Global Resilient Cities Network, where through the network, there are more intensive communication and shared learning process among the developing and developed countries. So I believe the existence of this or participating in this kind of global networks is very important, and it's also a homework at the same time to invite the local government, yeah, to be part of this kind of the global network and make a more intensive connection with the more developed countries. I think I will stop here. Maybe if you, yeah.
We only have 1 minute left for this Q&A session, but I just want to pick up the one, maybe earlier there was a question about private sectors. There it goes. How to raise interest and awareness of private sectors or community itself, because transformative governance is both. So very quick answers, please.
Just a quick answer. One of the ways we do it is to hold trainings for business sectors as well, where we invite different stakeholders to speak so that they know, first of all, why climate change adaptation and human rights are interlinked, what the role of the businesses are, and how the businesses can collaborate. And there was another question on maintaining collaboration amongst the questions. And that's a very good question, because we're not expecting local governments to do all of this. We're asking not only local governments, but also CSOs and universities in particular to be this platform that can host these, let's say, dialogues between local governments and other stakeholders to ensure that there is a constant, let's say, a reiterative and a constant process of engagement. And that is necessary to not only get funding, but also to make sure that all policies and programs developed at the national and local level are in sync?
Yeah, very brief, only 2 words, mutual interest. If there are no mutual interest, then it will be difficult to raise the interest and awareness of each stakeholder. So in a way, we need to find this mutual interest.
Not an easy task, but round of applause for Victor and Professor Wandari. And thank you all for a very active in questions. I'm sorry that we don't have time for this, but Victor and Professor Wandari are here with us for the whole entire day. So if you have any questions, follow-up questions or examples, please do come up to them. And now we have panel discussions which will be facilitated by my colleague, Joanna Showal. I hope I don't butcher your last name, but she is our thematic leader on non-discrimination and inclusion. She's based in Lund, Sweden. Prior to this, she has been working a lot with local governments and working with different RWI programs in different regions, including obviously Europe and South America. Yes, and Sweden. Please, Joanna. You can. Yes, thank you so much again.
So thank you very much, Wendy, for the introduction. Yes, my name is Johanna Sjöwall. I'm Swedish nationality, and I recently joined the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And it is I'm very humbled to be here. It's my first time in Korea. It's my first time in Asia. So please bear with me if anything that I will not pick up. So I'm extremely humble and grateful to be here with all of you today, and for the 4 panelists that we have online. We had a brief introduction of the panelists already. Repeated. We will have interventions by Romchat Wachiratana Khonu. I'm so sorry. It's a struggle for me with the pronunciation here, so hopefully I have not said too wrong here. And we have Albert Salamanca from Sweden. And the first one, sorry, that was in Thailand. And then we have Mayor Jerry Trenyas from the Philippines, and Mayor Dr. Genius Umar from Indonesia. We will have more introduction of when they come in individually. All of them have received questions on beforehand, because we are going to discuss, or they're going to have interventions on the following aspects. We are going to focus on the vital role, we're actually just enforcing and going into more depth, practical depth, of what we have already been touching on from different perspectives. The vital role of cities, that cities play in adapting to climate change, and the measures that cities in Asia and the Pacific have taken to incorporate a human rights-based approach to local climate change adaptation plans, policies, and programs. So we're going to go in more to depth with practical examples from the mayors, but also from a little bit outside perspectives. And the point of departure for all is that leveraging human rights will be key to ensuring that local adaptation is fair and equitable and leaves no one behind. I think that has been repeated several times, both in the inauguration yesterday and today in the prior presentations here. Each panelist will have approximately 15 minutes to have their say. And these are, we have the main questions for the first 2 panelists that will put us in the framework more of the why. They will look onto the why. Why do you think it's important for cities to integrate your human rights-based approach in the local adaptation plans in cities, in plans and processes? So we understand more of the background, like all the arguments for why to do it. And then we go further on with the mayors and looking into the we have an echo. Something happened there. Okay, we try again. Yes, so the first one is to set the framework of the why, and then we go further into more practical on the how when we listen to the mayors participating. So I would like to start with Ms. Romchat in Thailand. Do we have? Okay, here we have. Sorry, I've been looking at the wrong. So Ms. Romchat Vachiratana Arkonul is based in Thailand. Yeah, a little smile there from my pronunciation, maybe. Then based in Thailand at the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. She is the regional focal point on human rights, climate change, and since 2019, she has managed regional program to strengthen the capacity of regional actors in Asia to promote human rights in the context of climate change and the environment. She does that with an emphasis on human rights-based approach and gender mainstreaming perspective in the overall strategic planning. She has prior experience from the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand and also from the Human Rights Protection Bureau focused on economic, social and cultural rights and business and human rights. I give the floor to you, Romchat. Very welcome.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for this kind introduction. And thank you, Raoul Wallenberg Institute, for inviting the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office to be part of this important discussion today. And briefly about the work of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, or UN Human Rights. We are the leading UN entities on human rights, and we are providing assistance in the form of technical expertise and capacities development in order to support the implementation of international human rights standard on the ground. And we also assist government to fulfill their obligations and support individuals to claim their rights. In line with the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement on climate change, we aim to promote the human-based approach to the climate action, and these require that states take the ambitious adaptation and mitigation measures that are inclusive and respectful for communities affected by climate change. The guiding question I received in advance is why? Why do you think it's important for cities to integrate human-based approach into their local adaptation plan and process? As we have heard from the previous speakers, climate change is both an environmental and social justice crisis that raise interconnected demand for climate action and social equalities. And when we focus on the cities, urban population, and economic access are highly exposed to climate change due to the high population densities and infrastructure, and the rapid and often unplanned cities climate-related phenomena such as rising sea levels, coastal storms, heat stress, extreme precipitation, inland and coastal flooding, landslides, drought, increase of aridity, and water scarcity, and air pollution will have profound impact on a broad spectrum of city function, infrastructures, and service, and will interact with may exacerbate many existing stress. Urban human rights climate risks are increasing with wide space of negative impact on people and their health, livelihood, and access, as well as local and national economies and ecosystems. These risks are amplified for those who live in the informal settlement and hazardous areas, which often lack essential infrastructure and adaptive capacities, as well as individuals that are more vulnerable as a result of their age, income, disabilities, and other factors. The example of those who are most likely to face risk from the negative impact of climate change, especially when we are talking about urban cities, is supposed to be the urban poor, who are particularly vulnerable to climate change and natural hazards, as many poor urban inhabitants live in the overcrowded, unsafe, or exposed area as slum dwellings with little access to basic service. Furthermore, climate change increases the risk of increased ill health and disrupt livelihood. The next group of population is the people with disabilities who suffer from disproportionately high rates of morbidities and mortalities in emergencies and face challenge in accessing emergency support. The next one is the women and girls who are affected by the negative impact of climate change. Therefore, cities government play a vital role in providing reliable basic service, which are critical to improve resilience, and urban decision makers can be resilient and strengthen the climate resilience of people in vulnerable situations by start using the rights-based approach and adaptation measure developed by the contributions of people that climate change most negatively impact and that respond to their requirement and needs. Integrating human rights norms and principles in climate action or climate adaptation will improve the outcome, ensure a holistic approach that addresses the economic, social, cultural, and political dimension of climate change. The human rights-based approach to climate action will also empower the most affected groups and peoples. So human rights principles guide our programming in our process of the group of the programming, including the assessment and analysis, program planning and design, including setting of goals, objectives, and strategies. And they also implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. Among these human rights principles are universalities and inalienabilities, indivisibilities, interdependence and interrelatedness, non-discrimination and equalities, participation and inclusion, accountability, and the rule of law. A right-based approach and also analyze the obligations, inequalities, and vulnerabilities, and seek to redress discriminatory practice and unjust distribution of power. It also anchors plans, policies, and programs in a system of rights and corresponding obligation by international law. Therefore, a human rights-based approach should be integrated in any climate adaptation or mitigation measures. Affected individuals and communities should be allowed to participate without discrimination in the design, implementation, and leadership of these projects. And they must have access to due process and to remedy if their rights are violated. For climate action to improve human rights and climate justice, local government should include the life experience and expertise of the frontline communities in climate action at all levels. the practical steps that I would like to propose here, I have three steps, three considerations for the local government. The first one is to give information to everyone. Local government should make information about climate change available and easier to get access to, including provide information on early warning in languages and formats that are accessible and understandable to everyone everywhere. Also, local government should make sure that every person is protected by early warning system in the next 5 years. The next consideration is that people in vulnerable situations must participate. Local government must make sure that climate policies, planning and action involve people in vulnerable situations and that they meaningfully and effectively participate. And the last one, guarantee access to justice. Local government should promote access to justice in environmental matters, including access for people in vulnerable situations to court facilities, interpreters, and culturally appropriate service as needed. So I would like to end my first round here because I understand that we will have a next round of discussion and next question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I noticed that you also included your recommendations. I forgot to say that was an additional question that they were also asked. Everyone has been asked to also provide some recommendations to local governments based on their own findings. Thank you, Romchat, and it's correct. We will come back with possibilities for questions and answers a little bit further down. Next speaker, we have Albert Salamanca. Albert is Senior Researcher Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute's Asia Center, and he leads the Climate Change, Disaster and Development Cluster. He has a PhD in Geography from Durham University and over 20 years of experience working on climate change adaptation, natural resources management, conservation, development, and sustainable livelihoods issues in several countries in Southeast Asia. And his current research interests are in the area of resilience, risk and vulnerabilities, traditional ecological knowledge, mobility and spatial linkages, disaster displacement and sustainable livelihoods. And he has recently co-edited volumes such as Climate Change, Disasters and International Displacement in Asia and the Pacific, and the Routledge Handbook of Global Development, recently published, if you want to read more. So I give the floor to you, Mr. Salamanca.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Bangkok. I'm actually based in Bangkok, Thailand, together with the same place as Romchat, but although we don't work in the same organization. Based on the question, so maybe what I'll do is that I'll highlight two things in this presentation. One is that given that the topic is about the road to COP27, I will highlight discussions around loss and damage. In other words, I'll introduce loss and damage. And also I'll go in some detail on the study that Victor earlier mentioned on the national adaptation plans, which we have done during the last 2 years. So just to show, this is the study. If you haven't seen this one, I think our colleagues from RWI have copies on this study. So please reach out to them. Now, we're talking about human rights here. So the arguments that we've been making, Victor has been making, and all the others have been making is that climate action is human rights. Okay, and Romchat has articulated this very well. So I will not go into detail into this one because I'm sure you've already had enough ideas already on why climate change is a human right. And just to remind you also, the IPCC has released a report earlier this year. It's the report of the Working Group 1 which was on the science of climate change. And here there's a quote from Antonio Guterres, which is always the chair of the UNFCCC, who said that today's IPCC Working Group report is a code red for humanity. In other words, it's clear already the impacts, and the report, the IPCC report, highlighted why we need to act. And also our colleague also from Simara has reported about the outcome of Working Group 2 report, which is on impacts, adaptation, and climate change, and vulnerability, sorry. And then here's a quote from that report, or from IPCC. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And this is why we need to respond, and why the COP27 is an important part of that response, and specifically for cities, being part of national adaptation planning is critical. Here, let me just show you some information from that report. If you look at, let me just have a pointer. I don't think, okay. I don't think I can activate my pointer from here. Yeah, so if you just look at in terms of food, for example, so these are different temperature changes. So at 1.5 degrees, there's going to be a decline in terms of food by 6%. So global maize crop yield will be affected by 6%. And then by 2 degrees centigrade, 7 to 10% loss of rangeland livestock globally. Now, let me bring your attention towards cities. So if you look at cities at 1.5 degrees centigrade, 10.2 trillion dollars will be lost annually to sea level rise. $11.7 trillion at 2 degrees centigrade. And if we get to 3.5 degrees centigrade, more than a meter of sea level rise for coastal cities by 2080. So in other words, a lot of cities by then will be inundated. So in other words, so this lays out very clearly the impacts of climate change. And in here, this is a slide from Cities Alliance. So cities are the cause and also the solution. More than half of our population lives in cities, and 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from cities. And also cities are dealing with the effects of climate change. So I've highlighted earlier also, there's a lot of slums in cities, a lot of migrants are coming to cities, and there are different kinds of people living in cities that will be affected. In Southeast Asia, for example, I think the figure is around like 70% of cities are located along coastal areas, which means sea level rise is going to affect them. And plus, if you factor in non-climate factors, for example, land subsidence, then a lot of flooding is bound to occur in cities in Southeast Asia due to climate change and other factors. And this is where adaptation is urgent. So if you look at this particular slide, despite all policies and actions, so if you look at the blue one, we're still going to change. So we're expecting to change still on average at the mean, the median is 2.57 degrees centigrade. So in other words, by 2100, we are expecting a change despite all the efforts that we have right now, because all policies and actions that we have are not enough to address the challenge of climate change. So if you look at the slides, so 1.5 degrees is the goal of the Paris Agreement, but all scenarios point towards breaching that by 2100. Okay. So that's the size of the challenge. That's why we need to have a very concerted effort towards national adaptation planning, and not only that, but also effective as well. And also we need to start talking about loss and damage mechanisms. Now, this is an important part to consider, because us in the Global South, we actually account for only 7% of the emission. And that much emission is actually being contributed by the Global North countries. So in other words, there's a historical dimension here, and there's also an equity dimension. Historical in the sense that since the Industrial Revolution, they've been emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they've benefited from that. In fact, if you look at the share of major polluters, so these are fossil fuel-based companies between 1965 to 2018, 35% of total emissions are coming from these companies. So they come from fossil fuel and cement production. So all of these companies that are based in rich countries are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. That's why it's an important equity issue as well. And then if you look at impacts, so let me just go quickly here to impacts. So in 2021, there were 38 million internal displacements, of which 23.7 million is on disasters. And out of that, 22.3, so about 94% of 23.7 million is weather-related disaster. So in other words, weather-related, climate-related disasters are important cause of internal displacement. And then if you look at also in terms of the riskscape in Southeast Asia, 60% of the annual losses or disaster losses that happened in 2018, 2019, according to the UNDRR, is on drought. So again, climate-related, a slow onset event related to climate change. And then if you look at disasters as a percentage of the GDP, so for example, here we have the highest one, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar. And the next among the highest would be the Philippines. So around between 5% to 9% of the GDP will be lost due to disasters, so substantial. And then we have a decision to make, right? Because if nothing is done now, if cities are not going to act to respond to climate change, we get to a situation, the so-called hothouse Earth, wherein thresholds are going to be breached. And if we get to that point, there's no turning back. A lot of systems will suffer, coral reefs will die, permafrost will melt, and impacts will occur to us. And these impacts are irreversible. That's why we need to act now. But let's also look at the challenge. So for example, the challenge in finance. So this is the landscape of climate finance in 2019, 2020. If you look at it, much of the financing is on mitigation. So out of 632 billion for that year, 571 was on mitigation, and adaptation was a measly 46 million or 36 billion US dollars only. Okay, so there's a lot, of course, when you respond to climate change, you have to mitigate. In other words, you have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's fundamental. But we need to also address adaptation, because mitigating will take time. And during that time, more people will be affected, especially in the Global South. Yet financing for adaptation is really, really small. This is in terms globally. And now let me just talk about loss and damage, because this is the road to COP27, and the loss and damage will be an important part in the agenda, because in COP26 in Glasgow, one of the sort of outcome of that was really to highlight the importance of loss and damage. And this year, they're seeing it as a loss and damage COP in Egypt. And a lot of people are saying is that, especially those in the Global South, if loss and damage will not be part of the agenda of COP27, COP27 had already failed, because loss and damage is now becoming a reality. A lot of people suffered. So in the Philippines, for example, it's a clear. 2 weeks ago, there was a typhoon, Typhoon Nuru or Typhoon Karding in the Philippines, which in less than 10 hours or less than 12 hours, it has intensified to become a super typhoon before it hit the Philippines. Of course, it weakened as soon as it hit the Philippines, and it moved to Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. It has already weakened, but still, the devastation was substantial. So in other words, loss and damages due to climate change is real, okay? And here there's a definition. So in 2012, the UNFCCC defined loss and damage as the actual and or potential manifestation of impacts associated with climate change in developing countries that negatively affect human and natural systems. And then in the Paris Agreement, it's being defined as averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So if you notice that the Paris Agreement definition is less pointed, if you like, or less clear as the original UNFCCC discussion. And this is part of the conversation that's happening in COP this year, I think, if loss and damage will become part of the agenda. So those who are joining the COP27, I hope you will be part of this discussion in the COP to ensure that we really understand and move forward on loss and damage. So here, these are the perspectives on loss and damage. So to address climate change, as mentioned, we need to mitigate. But in that process of mitigation, it takes time. So we need to start adapting. But adaptation can only do so much. In other words, there's a limit to adaptation. So that limit will impose an existential, or will become an existential issue to certain kinds of people. So for example, small islands in the Pacific, or small islands in Indonesia, the Philippines, or a lot of coastal cities will be affected. So in other words, there are risks because of the immensity of the impacts of climate change. There are risks that cannot be avoided. That's why there will be losses and damages. So we really need to be realistic that as IPCC mentioned, the impacts, the climate change is no longer questionable. The anthropogenic role of climate change is unequitable. In other words, humans are causing climate change, and we not need only to adapt, but we also need to start thinking about loss and damage. And then, so these are just some of the dimensions of loss and damage, because there are hard and soft limits to adaptation. So for example, the hard limits would be in terms of where ecosystems and species can survive. And then there are also soft limits, but I will not go into that detail. I just want to show the importance here of loss and damage. And then these are some of the loss and damage issues that can occur due to climate impacts. So for example, you've got extreme weather events, you've got slow onset events. So extreme weather events, those are floods, heat waves, storms, slow onset events, sea level rise, rising temperature, changes in precipitation. And these are some of the impacts that are likely to occur due to this particular hazard. So you've got potential ecological impacts, non-economic impacts, so non-economic losses and damages, and economic impacts as well. So a very long list. So I will not go through each one of them, but just to show that the different types of losses and damages that can occur due to climate change. Now, just quickly on the NAPs, because this is an important part also as part of the Paris Agreement and as part of our response to climate impacts. So just, Madam Chair, if you can remind me how much time I've got, that would be good. But this part will be my last part in that presentation. So let me just talk quickly about NAPs, because I'm hoping that cities will play a strong role in preparing the NAPs. So the NAP process is a strategic process that enables countries to identify and address their medium and long-term priorities for adapting to climate change. So in the context of the Paris Agreement, NAPs are important instruments for short-term and medium-term planning. And then this is because in the Paris Agreement, one of the key recommendation or principle in the Paris Agreement is that adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, and should be based and guided by the best available science and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge, knowledge of indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems. So this is how we're going to approach adaptation, and this can be done through national adaptation planning. So these are some of the objectives of the NAPs: to reduce the vulnerability to impacts of climate change, to build adaptive capacities and resilience, and then to integrate climate change adaptation in a coherent manner into relevant new and existing policies, programs, and activities, in particular, development planning processes and strategies within all relevant sectors and at different levels. And I'm sure this applies to all cities. So I'm hoping that stakeholders in cities will take note of these objectives and intention in the NAPs to enable this integration. If you're looking for a framework on how to enable that integration, the NAP is one powerful framework for that. And then there are several NAPs already, as shown here, being submitted in the UNFCCC. So if you're looking for examples on some of those NAPs, you can look at these NAPs. The Fiji NAP is one of the best, for example, in terms of how it follows human rights principles. And we did this study. So together with RWI last year and the year before, we did this study to scan through all the NAPs to see what are the key insights that we have learned in terms of design and implementation of NAPs from a human rights perspective. So these are some of our findings. So few countries have directly mentioned human rights at all. So in the NAPs, in the 15 NAPs that we have reviewed, there are no, or there are less mentioned. And I think we can only name in terms of Fiji, Brazil, and another country that has implemented human rights principles in NAPs. But Fiji is a very good one in terms of how they were able to bring in a very strong human rights framing in the NAP process. And then there are also indirect references in some of the NAPs with regards to other human rights principles, for example, human rights to food, water, and health. And then, but the important point is that human rights principles and obligations are not generally utilized in a way that guide the NAP process. This is a challenge for us. And I see, as we have seen earlier, as discussed, Victor has provided a framework called the FIRE on how to integrate human rights principles and gender equality principles. That can be a useful tool as well to enable that integration in the NAP process. Going forward, we need to develop guidelines on that one. And then we have to engage with planners of city planners, for example, play an important role. Let me just show this slide. These are the different steps in NAP planning. So laying the groundwork, preparatory elements, implementation, reporting, and review. And then they happen like a cycle. It's a cycle. So this is where a human rights-based principle can be included or integrated into the different cycle in the NAP planning process. And this is also where cities can actually use, because this planning cycle could just be as well be applied in the context of cities. So again, if you're looking for a framework on how to integrate national adaptation planning into your cities, then the NAP could be one of them. Finally, I think I just want to leave with this point. It's really crucial to recognize in the NAP planning vulnerable groups and communities. So let's not just assume that all groups would have the same adaptation needs. We have to really recognize who they are and identify their needs and respond accordingly to those specific needs. Because if we just have a one-size-fits-all strategy to adaptation, it will likely not work, and it will just become maladaptive to certain groups of people. So again, let us recognize in our NAPs, in our city planning, the needs of different groups and communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Salamanca. And I'm sorry that I didn't point that you're actually based in Bangkok, but now now we know that for sure. Thank you for all the recommendations and very, very much food for thought here. We move on because we are running a little bit behind schedule, so we move on to Philippines. And there I understand that unfortunately Mayor Jerry Treñas will not be present himself, but will be represented by Mr. City Office, Mr. Butch Peñalosa. So please, I give you the word.
You're muted, sir.
Sorry that we have Mrs.
My
Salamanca.
apologies.
We are waiting for
My
Mr. Butch Peñalosa, and you are muted.
Can you hear me
so
now?
please switch on your microphone.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, and
Hi.
you talk in representation for the
Yes,
mayor
I'm
of Iloilo City.
Iloilo
of
City.
Philippines.
Yes. He is indisposed at the moment, and he asked me to speak in his behalf. I'm Jose Ronnie Peñalosa, Butch Peñalosa. I'm the city planning coordinator of Iloilo City. He asked me to tell you that the city has undertaken risk reduction and adaptation measures in a manner that is mindful of human rights. And as a local chief executive, he has worked with many stakeholders using multidisciplinary approaches to ensure that programs, projects, activities, including processes, are non-discriminatory. And pursuing adaptation measures designed to achieve balanced environmental, social, and economic benefits. So I'll share to you some of the things that we're working on, and I'd like to give out some on how the city has done this. The city is mainstreaming the climate risk, disaster risk assessment in the local development plans, actually. And it is popularizing or laymanizing the climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk advocacies and education by using the local language or the dialect, and soliciting people's involvement in laying down the blueprint for the city's development, which ensures the people's safety and security, and of course, its adaptation to climate change. And this is on the way we plan things, which is a participatory approach, actually also. And here, it is important to mention that you need to craft a vision of the local of the city, which is cognizant of the basic rights of the people. And the vision will be the one guiding the planning efforts of the locality. Also, it is important to adhere to participatory and consultative processes in planning and programming to ensure participation of the various sectors and to be inclusive in the adaptation responses and development initiatives. Of course, needless to say, things should be guided. The planning effort should be guided by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the country's commitment to it, such as the National Development Agenda or the National Development Thrusts or targets. Also, I must mention that the city undertakes, and this is a very important aspect of urban governance here in our city, and this is on partnership building and building from it. And this means building partnerships with the scientific community to help strengthen capabilities, widen knowledge, and expand resources pool on climate change. And one in particular partner that we maintain is with the Manila Observatory. Also, the partnership is to identify risks to the community and the people. Also, building partnership with local universities and colleges here is also equally important. And this is to augment the resources of the local government for environmental programs and disaster preparedness and resilience. Also, what is being maintained is the building of partnerships with civil society organizations, business and private sector for the same agenda. And it is recommended that we engage with all sectors, the NGOs, the people's organizations, the civil society organizations, business, academia, the religious group, the LGBTQ, women, senior citizens, the youth, and labor groups in addressing climate change and crafting risk reduction measures to protect the people and the environment. And it can come in the form of policy support, financial assistance to programs and projects that protects the environment. It is important also for us to institutionalize and maintain sustainability. And we do this by sustaining the programs and projects across city administration terms through medium and long-term plans, mandated work structures, and local legislations and policies. And for the plans, we have the comprehensive land use plan, the local climate change action plan, ecological solid waste management plan, the shelter plan, health plan, etc. And for work structures, we have the school board, we have the health board, local development council, the disaster risk management council. And for local policies, we have particular interest in urban greening. And we recommend the institutionalization of these programs through the passage of ordinances and policies, and by crafting them inside or including them in the medium and long-term plans. And this will ensure the mandates needed, the structural and the budgetary requirements. Another effort of the city is gearing towards greening and resilient infrastructure. So this we do by a lot of tree growing activities and protection of our mangrove resources. For public safety, it's important for us to decentralize the emergency response logistics by establishing response centers throughout the city and designing its distribution with careful regard to specific differentiated needs of the target groups. Another way is to monitor and keep an updated inventory of families and exposed assets at multi-hazard zones and prioritize their protection and rehabilitation in all related plans and programs. Also, in particular, we're keen at adopting green designs in the resettlement, relocation houses with consciousness for the unique special needs of the varying age groups, religious beliefs of people, etc. Now, I'd like to share to you some of the challenges and the opportunities that the mayor faced in governing and administrating the city. One in particular is the regularly updated climate and disaster risk data and metrics are still not fully communicated in many communities and barangays. And that's why many are still exposed and vulnerable to the climate change and disaster risks and hazards. Now, but there are opportunities here. There are now growing efforts towards improving the info dissemination system and mass education using data from universities, scientists, researchers, resulting maps and IEC materials of which are now slowly but continuously being shared to communities. And social media also is contributing as effective medium of communication too. Another challenge for us is that there is poor access still to climate financing windows. And however, on a positive note, there is now a growing awareness on its availability as a result of massive advocacies by ODAs and the global community and the renewed and strengthened climate change program of the country. Another challenge is the limited technical skills and in-house competence for climate change mitigation adaptation and the NAP process, which Albert earlier was sharing to us. However, there's a growing presence and availability of donor agencies, government agencies, and civil society organizations that are advocating for adaptation measures and providing technical support, grant, or even climate financing. Another challenge is that, and I guess this holds true as well for many of the villages in the Philippines, and even cities and municipalities, that traditional leaders who are more reactive and has bias towards dole outs. But on a positive note, there are now avenues available for continuing education on risk reduction and climate change adaptation, which can change perspectives and inspire affirmative action towards being proactive. And the other opportunities we find value of is fora and conferences like this, where we get to listen and learn from the sharings of other government units and the experts. So this way, we also are able to overcome our challenges and harness some of our existing resources and good attributes to further climate change adaptation and mitigation. We thank this forum, especially for the earlier sharing by Albert Salamanca, who talks about a national adaptation plan, which is, as a city planner, that is my strong bias towards this particular part of urban governance, the development planning. With that, I'd like to say thank you and a good morning to everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peñalosa, and thank you for doing this on short notice. We move forward to the intervention by Mayor Dr. Genius Omar from Indonesia. He's a mayor of the Pariaman city in Indonesia since 2018. He's previously also been vice mayor since 2013. He's a co-president of the TPO since 2019 and also head of vice chairman, secretary section parliament of the Republic of Indonesia. He was that for several years and held several different positions for the parliament, and he is also a frequent lecturer at university levels and postgraduate courses in areas such as research methodology and strategic management, public policy analysis, postgraduate lecturer at Master on Public Administration program. So I say welcome to you, the final panelist.
Okay, thank you, the chairman, and also all speaker and also all attending of this seminar. I'm very happy to join this discussion. That's very useful for us for the words. So I talk about climate change in Pariaman. What is the implementation? Pariaman integrates a HRBA into local climate adaptation plan and the process by the implementing Pariaman Green City. So we, in our vision, Pariaman is Green City and also as a tourism city. green tourism city. So ecotourism, any that sustainability base of strategic planning we do in Pariaman, like green planning and also green landscaping planning. So how we set up our landscaping to sustainable development and also for the climate change. So we have also green open space, beach green belt, and also waterfront city. All the city is growing up by the waterfront city strategy. And also green community, we have some group of young people who obey the environment to be participation in the effort of green development, and also green waste, how we manage our waste to be useful for our agriculture also. And also green water, we set up, I think, our water to be green water. And also green transportation, we reduce air emission by school bus for the student. So not many bus come here around the Pariaman, but we have special bus for the student to look around the school. The second one is integrated collaboration between local government, private sector, and also the community. We have some community that concern to environment and also climate change. We have a Tabut driving club that's concerned in coral reef protection in our undersea. And also we have Green Community Forum. They said, they plan mangrove. We have mangrove in our beach. So this community is do any activity to make sure that the mangrove will grow up very good. So we have also cycler community. There's a cycling community here. We have a sport tourism who protect our environment. So what is green planning? We have green landscape of Pariaman, determine green open space in Pariaman, including sustainable agriculture, and also green park or taman kota. Designation and development of tourism area according to master plan of tourism development, and also environmental carrying capacity for the the operator of tourism, and also operator of environmental group. A sustainable and integrated tourism planning. And how is green open space? We have city forest. We're practicing city forest, implementing city forest, the mangrove tourist park. We have beach green belt and also waterfront city. The green community, where I talked to you before, so many group will protect the environment. And also we have river community conservation. Here, we protect the clean of the river, and also green water source security. We have the policy about that one, and also we implement about the policy. And also we have how to use the water resource by the very efficient, like biopori and also anything. We have also green waste. We reduce, reuse, recycle of our waste, and also we have some project to reuse again the waste, and also green transportation, NLC, and the thing. That's all what we implemented in the implementation in Pariaman City. That is, we know that climate change is human right. We trust about that one. Thank you very much. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Genius Elmar, very brief and good and efficient comment. We now have possibilities for questions and answers. Any more in-depth questions, maybe on the challenges a little bit more? We have a question here in the room. I don't know if we have in the, is that already passed in the system? Is this your? No, it's we have an additional question. Should we take, we take this one first and then we have it written? Sorry? Because if we already have one up here. Yeah, we go ahead with, we have a participant in the room with a question.
Okay, my name is Jaman, come from Bangladesh. Thanks for a very nice presentation, but my question to the respected mayors. So far, our understanding, many set policies regarding the different issues are available in different local government, especially the climate, disaster, risk mitigation, adaptation, and many others. But when such types of the policies going to the implementation, there is a lot of gap in between the people's participation, gap in the people's level consultations, and at the same time is a difference in between the policies and the implementation. Can any respectable mayor, if provide the answer, what is the way to meet up such types of the gap for including the different relevant stakeholders for appropriately address and overcome such procedures? Thank you.
Which one of our panelists would feel that they would want to answer this question?
If I may?
Yeah. Yep.
If I may.
We have here.
I think the impacts of climate change is something that is easily felt by the communities. And so it was easy to convince the communities that in solving these issues, be it short-term, medium-term, or long-term issues, everyone was convinced that they should all contribute to finding a solution. So I don't know how it is with the other countries, but in the Philippines, because everyone felt the need, everyone felt saw the problem and was impacted by the problem, and so everyone agreed to helping solve the problem. And so when the city government invited people to start attending workshops and asking what is it really happening in their localities and how they thought things can change and how they can contribute. Now, it was easy for the city government to craft short-term and medium-term plans. And so if you ask me, while there is indeed that huge gap between the planning and the implementing, there is a growing trend now of people involvement, right from problem identification to finding solutions. I don't know if that answers the question.
Looks like you've answered. Thank you. We had more questions on the screen. So we have a specific one directed to Albert, talking about adaptation. It will be strongly related with the global goal on adaptation to how does the GGA play a significant role here?
So,
are you there, Albert, to respond to this one?
Is it directed to me, right? Can this confirm?
Are they repeated?
Yeah, so the question was directed to me. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the question is about the global goal of adaptation, right? I think it's fundamental. So what is the global goal, or what are the global goals on adaptation? One, it's building resilience, enhancing adaptive capacity. And the third one is reducing vulnerability. In fact, in COP27, one of the important, I think, agenda item that will be discussed is on the global goal. In other words, how do we operationalize the global goal on adaptation? Because to operationalize it, that means we have to create metrics on how do we understand. So for example, what does reducing vulnerability mean? What does enhancing capacity? What does building resilience? What do they mean in practice? So that would be the discussion so that we can easily monitor and we can easily evaluate also whether we have achieved them in the context of the Paris Agreement. Because if you compare it with the global goal on mitigation, the global goal on mitigation is very simple, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's very measurable, it's highly quantitative. Whereas the global goal on adaptation is qualitative, and that's why there needs to be a discussion to operationalize it. So in answer to the question, in short, it's important. It's important to be guided by the global goal on adaptation. Thank you very much.
For a very clear answer. We have scroll up a little bit so we see them. We have one here to the professor. No. We're checking here on the screen. Which one? The top one? Top one? The top? No. The top. Which one are you preferring? And the audience is here preferring questions. We have a vote here.
Yeah, so we can use
How we encourage?
how encourage and then based on your experience.
Okay, so now we have the two questions following each other. How we encourage green climate funding and how to engage private sectors and business sectors to contribute net zero climate neutrality targets. And based on your experience, how the local government can make a policy for climate change adaptation with a rights-based approach. I think we actually have listened to some examples of that already, but I think it's at least first to focus on how we encourage green climate funding and how to engage private sectors and business sectors to contribute to net zero climate neutrality targets. There is no specific name on this question, so I think it's yes, Romchat, maybe are you with us?
Yes.
Do you feel that you would like to answer this question?
On the private sectors, I think what Victor mentioned in his presentation about making the impact of climate change a business case is really important. Because if we frame that into the right language with the stakeholders, and that the business has to also contribute and take part in to address the risk of their business operation as well. That is part of the important role of business actors. And I think business can also not only from the government side, of course, in terms of the human rights obligation, the government has the obligation to regulate and oversee the activities of business and private actors on anything that could violate human rights in their jurisdiction, including the impact of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions arise from the business activities as well. On the other hand, business also has the influence or can take a pledge or request for government to act more on the to increase more ambitions and regulation or policies as well. So I can see that is a smart mix in terms of the regulation and sense an incentive for government and business to act on this issue. In terms of the obligations under human rights law and standard, business also have the responsibilities to address and respect human rights. We have the framework on UN Guiding Principle on Human Rights. In the UN Guiding Principle on Human Rights, business also have the responsibilities to conduct the human right due diligence on their obligations. So I think this is how we can really engage business and private sector to be part of the local adaptation plan and work together with the local government.
If I may add as well to that
Oh, yes, please.
response by Ramchat, if we think of adaptation as actually good development, so there are already a lot of sources, right? Because you do that in your city planning. So in other words, you can use your city budget to enable good development that also is adaptive. So the same also with national budgets. So in the Philippines, for example, there are access to the so-called People's Survival Fund. In Indonesia, there's the Climate Trust Fund. So there are different sources of funding. Globally, also, you can access the Green Climate Fund. Cities can receive funding from the Green Climate Fund as well as from the Adaptation Fund. And although there are some details that cities need to comply with, but those opportunities are there. So it's just a question of cities having good ideas, good fundable ideas, and then reach out to these different funding bodies to fund their activities. So fundamental to this, of course, is a very good national adaptation plan or good city adaptation plan. If you have those plans, then I think it will be easier to mobilize the funding that's needed. And of course, also there are the bilateral and multilateral development funds available. So it could be the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and different governments who are offering funding to cities. And then, of course, as Ramchat mentioned, there are also private finance flows that can be also deployed to contribute to the needs of cities. But more importantly, in the context of loss and damage, and because again, this is the road to COP27, one of the important discussion items in the loss and damage negotiation would be the creation of a facility on loss and damage. So again, there's a lot to be said, a lot of needs to be discussed with regards to this, but maybe if you're interested, if cities are really interested, then take part of this discussion, because maybe you could just be able to provide the rationale why we need to create a loss and damage financing facility. If that is not possible, because of course, obviously it's going to be highly political, maybe other options with regards to financing could be explored through available means that we've got at the moment. Thank you.
To interventions and responses, we have space for one more question. Which one? Yeah, we have to the mayor. We just dropped it. The little bit more up, a bit more, scroll up. We just saw it, a little more up. How does the council identify those who are most at risk from the impacts of climate change, and what is being done to assist the most vulnerable? We have that question maybe to Umar in Indonesia. If not, it can be responded by Mr. Ponyelosa.
May I respond to that? Yes. The city has Iloilo City has a work unit. It's called the Iloilo City Urban Poor Affairs Office. And what this is a mandated office that goes around the city and monitors inventories, the situation of the urban poor sector. And in their inventory, this is how families below the poverty line are documented, as well as those informal settler families. So this is one way of improving the planning efforts of the city, getting a good baseline data on who are more or most vulnerable and who are in most need. So through a work structure that is mandated and institutionalized. The other way is really in task forces. These are ad hoc committees designed to help address very specific task assignments. And then in this way also, people involvement or the participation of even the marginalized groups are seen. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that even at the level of problem identification, the vulnerable groups are already considered.
I don't know if we have another intervention by Dr. Genius. Let us know. Otherwise, I think we have to close the session here. I say thank you very much to all the participants in the room and online, and of course to the 4 panelists. Thank you very much for sharing this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're about like 5 minutes left of this session, but I hope you learned from the speakers and panelists that we have earlier. I certainly do. And I only have a very quick announcement for the survey. We are very participatory and inclusive on these sessions, on all of our sessions, and we really want to have your feedbacks on the theme, on the discussions, and then how we can improve our next sessions or other intervention of ours on these specific issues and others. So you are also open to provide us inputs on what are other areas that RWA should do. So please follow the link that we're gonna share very shortly. And yeah, just scroll down, please. Yes. So this is the QR code for our surveys, and for online participants, you are also welcome to give your feedback on this session. And I personally would like to thank Romchat again, and Albert, and Mr. Butch, and Mayor Genius for joining us this morning. I know it's very early where you are, but I really like your spirit and the knowledge that you shared with us. And to Victor and Professor Wiwandari, thank you so much for being here, for sharing very good insights, and for everyone who's joining us in GwangJu. It's been a very fruitful discussion. I'm really sorry that we don't have enough time to catch all your questions, but if you do have some burning issues, you can email it to me, and then I can forward it to the respective panelists. Again, thank you so much. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of the forum. And for the offline participants, we have time for picture taking. Thank you. Bye.